Hello and welcome back to another episode of UFC by the Numbers. This is episode number 2. Let's get right into it. So UFC 2, originally called Ultimate Fighting Championship Part 2 and later changed to UFC 2 No Way Out. The event took place March 11th, 1994, which was just 4 months after UFC 1. It took place at the Mammoth Garden Arenas in Denver, Colorado, and it had an attendance of 2,000 people. And the event did a buy rate of about 300,000 pay-per-view buys, which is pretty impressive if you compare that to some of the other pay-per-view events that they've had over the years. We had a few familiar faces on the broadcast team. Once again, we had NFL legend Jim Brown in the commentary booth, and Brian Kilmeade got himself a promotion from ringside announcer up to the big boy seat on the commentary team. And once again, your ring announcer was Rich G-Man Goins. The new guy joining the commentary team was Ben Perry. Ben was an actor, stuntman, and stunt coordinator, working on many Chuck Norris movies, but also a few others as well, such as The Good Guys Wear Black, The Octagon, Eye for an Eye, The Kindred. Ben had also trained with the Gracies for some time before this event had started. The man taking over for Brian Kilmeade as the ringside announcer was Herbert Perez. Perez was a World Taekwondo champion, having won the gold medal at the 1987 World Cup, also winning a gold medal in the 1987 Pan Am Games, and a gold medal at the 1992 Barcelona Olympics. He went on to star as himself with the nickname Olympus on the 1995 to 1997 martial arts TV series WMAC Masters. After fighting in his short TV career, Perez turned his attention to politics and was elected to the council of the city of Foster in 2011. He also briefly served as mayor and vice mayor before being recalled on March 3rd in the 2020 California primary elections. Another new face joining the team was that of Big John McCarthy, the referee. Big John trained with Hoyce Gracie and is now one of the most respected people in MMA. He was a police officer with the Los Angeles Police Department, was on the streets during the LA riots in '92, and helped create the unified rules that we know today. He's also appeared in movies and television, usually as himself on shows including Friends, Entourage, NCIS Los Angeles, and he also has a pretty good podcast with Josh the Punk Thompson called Weighing In, which I would highly suggest checking out. There were a few slight rule changes to this event. As opposed to UFC 1, there were no rounds, there were no time limits, and groin strikes were now legal. They had twice the number of competitors this time, from 8 to 16, and the first 7 fights weren't shown on pay-per-view or the home video. And the winner this time received $60,000 instead of $50,000.
60 G's, baby!
So the very first fight in the opening round was Scott Morris versus Sean Dougherty. Sean is actually the youngest fighter to have ever competed in the UFC. When he stepped into the octagon, he was 18 years, 3 months, and 19 days old. This was his only UFC event. He did retire with an 0-2 record in MMA, losing to Minoru Suzuki and Pancrase. He eventually went on to get his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and is still doing seminars to this day. Scott the American Ninja Morris. Morris listed ninjutsu as his fighting style, representing Robert Bussey's Warrior International. It's a splinter art of ninjutsu, and not really much is known about Scott. This was his only UFC event, however, and he retired with a 2-1 record in MMA. Scott, the American Ninja Morris versus Sean Dougherty. Scott comes out fast, and both guys clinch up. Morris lands a good right hand. Scott eventually gets shot in a front headlock position up against the fence, and he rolls back and ends up landing in mount, and he ends up finishing the fight with a mounted arm-in guillotine. Very ninja-esque. And Scott Morris is moving on to the next round. Pat Smith, one of 3 returning fighters from UFC 1. Pat lost to Ken Shamrock by heel hook in the first round of UFC 1. Ray Wizard. Ray was a 5-time international karate champion. He was a Kempo karate black belt under Steve Muhammad's Black Karate Federation. This was his only fight in MMA. Pat Smith versus Ray Wizard. Pat comes out and immediately clinches up with Ray, and there's lots of clinching and grappling against the fence, and Pat eventually sinks in a standing guillotine, locks it up, and Ray tries to get out of it, but he taps just a bit too late, and he ends up going out. He's really out. And Pat Smith is moving on to the next round. Johnny Rhodes. Johnny was a 39-year-old karate practitioner and kickboxer. He had a black belt in Shorinji Ryu Karate and was a Nevada State kickboxing champion. He was a last-minute addition to the event, so he didn't get one of those cool intros that the rest of the fighters got. And this was his only venture into MMA. David Levicki. Levicki had a background in Wing Chun Kung Fu and was a former Army Ranger. This was his only UFC event, and he finished his career with a 1-3 record in MMA, with the highlight of his career most likely being a loss to Hoyce Gracie in the second round of Valley Tudo Japan 94. Johnny Rhodes versus David Levicki. Rhodes starts the fight with a beautiful jumping spinning back kick. They clinch up against the cage, and Rhodes eventually secures the takedown, and Rhodes uses some real good ground and pound, and eventually Levicki resorts to the double punch from the bottom, a technique rarely seen today. There are some long periods of inactivity in the closed guard, which is kind of understandable. I'm sure this whole style is new to both these guys. This was a really long and taxing fight with a lot of groundwork. Eventually Rhodes though opens up a nasty cut on David's eye, and Rhodes starts working the body and head from the guard, and then Levicki eventually taps due to the strikes and just from sheer exhaustion, I'm guessing. And Johnny Rhodes, the 39-year-old alternate who had only just gotten the call to come down to the event just a few days before, manages to secure a really hard-fought victory against a much bigger opponent, and he's going to move on to the quarterfinals. Frank or Freck Hammacker. Frank was a Sambo expert and Greco-Roman wrestler. Frank had experience in several unsanctioned MMA events known as Fighting in Paradiso out of Amsterdam. This would be his only official entry into MMA. Thaddeus Luster. Thaddeus was a 7th degree black belt in Sansu Kung Fu, and this was his only MMA event. Frank Hammacker versus Thaddeus Luster. They clinch up real early, and Thaddeus takes down Frank, and Frank quickly reverses and moves right into mount. Frank controls him and is looking for the Ezekiel choke. Thaddeus muscles his way back up to his feet. Frank then hip tosses him right back down to the ground, moves to mount, and just continuously looks for the Americana, and he ends up locking up a one-handed Americana, which is also quite rare. Don't think you'd see that today. And Frank wins by submission. Unfortunately, he would not be able to continue in the tournament due to a hand injury and would later be replaced by Fred Eddish. Orlando the Gladiator Wheat. Wheat was originally from Suriname and moved to Europe at a young age. In the broadcast, they say he's French, but in later interviews, he says Dutch. So, I think you gotta take the man at his word. Orlando fought in Thailand many times before trying his hand in MMA. He also competed in many K1 Grand Prix events from 1994 to 1997. He ended up retiring with a 1-5 record in MMA, fighting mainly in Europe, but also having a match against one of the all-time greats in Sakuraba, and this would be his only UFC event. Robert Luccarelli, American kickboxing and boxing style. He was also a snake pit fighter. whatever that means. In 1987, he was the Empire State Games boxing finalist. This was his only venture into actual MMA. He had competed in some strange tag team Valley Tudo events and some other, what I can only assume are unsanctioned fights. Orlando Wheat versus Robert Luccarelli. Robert comes out with some very ineffective leg kicks, especially against a seasoned Muay Thai fighter, and eventually shoots for the football style takedown. Robert eventually gets Orlando in an arm-in bulldog choke, almost like a reverse clock choke, if you will. Orlando escapes and lands a ruthless elbow to the back of the neck and follows it up with a knee right to the face. And while Robert is on all fours, Orlando just soccer kicks him in the head, and he walks off in victory. But unfortunately for Robert, the fight's not over. Big John's not calling it, and Orlando goes back to a basically defeated Luccarelli, who is almost begging for the fight to stop, and Orlando hits him with another elbow to the back of the neck and follows it up with some more vicious elbows until Luccarelli's corner finally throws in the towel. This is a rough one to watch, and Orlando Wheat is moving on to the next round by merciful corner stoppage. Remco Pardo. Remco was a junior national champion in judo and also had a taekwondo black belt. He was also a practitioner of Japanese jiu-jitsu and was the world champion in 1993 when the sport held their first world championships in Denmark. Remco was also cornered by Gerard Gordeau. Alberto Cerro Leon, who was a Pensac Salat specialist from Spain. He was the 1987 and 1989 Pensac Salat world champion. Looking to make some money as a martial arts instructor, he moved to California, where he started to train in a variety of different martial arts, including Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under the Gracie family. And the Gracies actually wanted him to compete in UFC 1, but unsure of the nature of the competition and success that the promotion would have, he declined. This was his only MMA event, and he eventually returned to Spain, where he would go on to star in a reality show. Kind of like a Spanish Survivor type deal. Remco Pardo versus Alberto Cerro Leon. The fight starts with Alberto landing some quick early strikes, but Remco is able to easily get the fight to the ground, and from this point the fight is pretty much over. Remco controlling the fight, going from mount to side control. Alberto is tough though, and there is no give up in him until he actually gives up when Remco sinks in an Ezekiel choke. And Remco moves on to the next round via submission. Jason Delucia. Jason was an expert in the 5 animal style of Kung Fu, Taekwondo, and Aikido. He was also one of the first participants in the Gracie Challenge matches, where he lost to Hoist by mounted triangle. After beating Trent Jenkins in the alternate bout of UFC 1, he had earned his spot on this event. Scott Baker had a background in Wing Chun and kickboxing, and is the author of the book Chi Kung, Development and Practical Application in the Wing Chun Kung Fu. This would be Scott's only UFC event, and he would retire with a 1-1 record in MMA. Scott Baker versus Jason Delucia. Jason comes out with some strong side kicks, and eventually Jason goes for the takedown, but ends up just pulling guard. Jason then allows Scott to mount him just so he can sweep him. Classic taking advantage of the white belt technique. Jason lands a headbutt and then stands up and drops down for a straight ankle lock. Scott is able to escape though and gets the fight standing again. And Scott ends up taking top position and side control, but Jason again just allows him to move to mount just so he can sweep him again. But Scott learns quick and sweeps Jason with the same technique and ends up on top of him. Jason, however, throws up a nice triangle but just can't get it locked up properly or cut the angle enough for the choke. Some pretty good defense from Scott and some really good scrambling. Jason throws up another triangle from the guard. Scott tries to roll out of the triangle. Scott then ends up in a mounted triangle, and Jason starts to land a few strikes, and he tells Scott, you should tap, it's over. Which Jason, I think, kind of knows, because this is how Hoist finished him in their challenge match. And Scott eventually does tap, and Jason moves on to the quarterfinals. Hoyce Gracie the return of the UFC 1 winner. He was also voted the 1993 Fight Matrix Fighter of the Year, and this will not be the last time we see Hoyce. Minoki Ichihara. Ichihara was one of the stars of Japanese karate. He was trained under Takashi Azuma, founder of the Daido Juku Karate Organization in 1981. Daido Juku was a hybrid splint-off of Kyokushin karate, incorporating judo techniques as well as headbutts. He was the 1990, 91, and 92 Daido Juku heavyweight tournament champion, as well as a 1990 and 1993 openweight tournament champion. Before this event, he had fought on the Kakutogi Olympic 1, a kickboxing event in a mixed sort of match, with one round being bare knuckle, one round with gloves on. It was very bizarre. This was his only MMA fight, and he actually ended up only fighting one more time in a Daido Juko tournament that same year before officially retiring. Hoist Gracie versus Minoki Ichihara. Both guys exchanged a few kicks at the beginning, and Royce eventually shoots for the takedown and easily gets it, and he moves right into mount. Royce lands a lot of palm strikes and body shots before eventually transitioning to the back, and from there Royce is eventually able to sink in a lapel choke and wins by submission yet again. And now moving on to the first quarterfinal fight of the evening. We had Scott Morris versus Pat Smith. Scott rushes in and clinches up with Pat, and eventually Scott pushes him right up against the cage, and he tries the same roll to choke that he did in the first round against Sean, but Scott doesn't have the front headlock position, and the roll doesn't work out, and Scott ends up in a very bad position, and Pat proceeds to absolutely destroy poor Scott Morris, and just a barrage of punches to the head and neck, and a few ruthless elbows to finish it off. And Pat Smith's moving on to the semifinals. Fred Eddish, a Shorinji Kempo karate school instructor and 5th degree black belt. He had responded to a magazine ad looking for fighters for the UFC tournament. Unfortunately, by the time he had responded, all the spots had been filled, and even the possibility of being an alternate was gone. But when Ken Shamrock broke his hand and one of the already scheduled alternates had to fill in for Ken, and Frank Hammacker had to pull out due to injury, a spot opened up for Fred. Hoyce Gracie found Fred backstage and told him he had 10 minutes to find his cornerman, get his gi on, and get into the octagon. This would be Fred's only UFC event. And in 2009, he re-entered MMA competition at age 53 and won a fight over Kyle Fletcher by TKO in the first round. Johnny Rhodes versus Fred Eddish. It starts off with Fred throwing a few kicks which have very little behind them, and Johnny connects with a straight right, and this is the beginning of the end. Fred tries to keep Rhodes at bay with his legs, and Rhodes lands a big right hand and busts Eddish open. Rhodes lands a few more strikes, and Eddish tries to get to his knees but ends up eating some knees in the process from Rhodes. And the commentary team starts suggesting that Eddish's corner should stop the fight, and Rhodes eventually gets a choke and Eddish taps. But massive respect to Eddish. He toughed this out and he stuck in there for a lot longer than I think a lot of other people would. And Johnny Rhodes is moving on to the semifinals. Orlando Wheat versus Remco Pardo. Remco stalks Orlando and gets him up against the fence. Remco uses a very similar technique that he used in the first round to get Orlando to the ground. Remco controls the position very easily. Nothing really happens for a while. Remco is just kind of holding him, but then just eventually unloads some hard elbows right to the temple and jaw, and Orlando goes out hard. And that moves Remco into the semifinals. Jason Delucia versus Hoyce Gracie, the rematch that Jason has been waiting for a long time. They both clinch up in the center of the octagon. Jason actually gets Hoyce down, but gets stuck in Hoyce's guard, and Hoyce ends up hitting a beautiful sweep and ends up in mount. Jason tries to push Hoyce off of him, but keeps putting his arms in real danger, and eventually Hoist locks up the armbar. Jason stands up, and that just sinks his arm in even deeper. Jason taps multiple times before Hoist lets go or Big John is able to step in, and Jason's arm is definitely in a bad spot right now. Anyone who's ever had an armbar put on them and had their arm extended, it's not a nice feeling. And Hoist makes quick work of his rematch with Jason, and he's moving on to the semifinals. Moving on to the semi-finals, and the first fight is Pat Smith versus Johnny Rhodes. Both guys landed some good strikes in the beginning. Pat backs Johnny up against the cage, and Pat lands a real nice headbutt and eventually sinks in another standing guillotine and nearly lifts Johnny right up off his feet. Johnny appears to tap, but it goes unnoticed, and then Johnny taps with his feet and the corner throws in the towel nearly at the same time, and Pat moves on to the finals. In the second semi-final match, we had Hoist Gracie versus Remco Pardo. Both guys staring each other down for quite some time. You can see there is a big size difference between the two of them. Hoist eventually shoots for a takedown. Hoist does struggle to get Remco to the ground, but eventually he hooks Remco's leg and is able to sweep him out and get right onto his back. Puts both hooks in, reaches over and grabs the far side lapel, or collar, whatever you want to call it. Which enables Hoist to eventually get the tap, and he moves on to the finals again. And Hoist has finished all of his 6 opponents in both tournaments so far by submission. We started with 16, and now we're down to 2. And we have Hoyce Gracie taking on Pat Smith. Pat comes out with a lunging front kick and at his own detriment closes all the space between them, and Hoyce easily secures a body lock and attempts the same takedown he used against Remco, and eventually takes Pat down and ends up in his half guard. Hoyce easily passes to mount. Pat tries to bridge Hoyce over, but he just can't. Hoyce lands a few short punches to the face. Pat realizes he's not going to get out of this position and taps. Maybe smart of him taking less damage, but with the heart we've seen from some of the other competitors in the early rounds, it seems he did give up rather quickly. And Hoyce retains his crown as the UFC champion, again defeating all of his opponents by submission and taking home that check for $60,000. And that's it. Another UFC event in the books. Twice as many fighters, twice as many fights, twice as many finishes, a lot of action, a lot of chaos. I'm going to say it again, I really enjoy putting these together. It's a lot of fun for me going back and watching these old fights, and I can't wait to get on to the next one. So until next time, peace.